therapist, and I've always tried to emulate his therapeutic techniques. He was one of the early people who pointed out the importance of empirically based therapy, and that's always been something that I've kept with me all through my life. If I put these all together, what is the vision that they gave me that I moved forward with, and I am now the echo of? In research, put all your hypotheses at severe risk for disconfirmation. Follow the data. Don't try to stuff your data into an existing theory. You're better off with disconfirmation than confirmation because you end up learning more from that. In addition to predictive validity and concurrent validity, you've got to look at construct validity. That is the underlying causes for the phenomena that you're studying. One of the reasons for doing this is that understanding of the processes is critical for etiological and causative research. Causative research is going to allow you to produce empirically validated developmental models, and those are essential for primary prevention. And what we have to do is we have to focus on developing primary prevention in our field. Also, in clinical practice, their view was to make sure that the cognitive distortions that plague humanity don't bias your research and clinical decisions. And secondly, that validated actuarial mechanical formulas are better than clinical intuition. So these were all of the things that I took forward, and these are the things that I have tried to teach my students. And so I perceive myself to be a visionary voice echo.
So one of my takeaways from that is that pretty early in your career, you had some strong mentors. What would you say to students starting out or those early in their career? We often hear, I'm new to this, I'm a little bit intimidated to go talk to someone like Ray Knight and ask him questions. So what would you say to those folks?
Well, I think there are two things, and you've already hit on one of them that's important. The first thing is you have to identify for yourself the career that is going to make you happiest and is going to be the most fulfilling career. And then you have to proceed fearlessly in trying to achieve that career. But even though you're going to proceed fearlessly, it's important for you to identify in your life those mentors whom you admire and you trust, and take their advice seriously. Doesn't mean you have to always follow their advice, but you have to take it seriously. And I think those are the two greatest principles. Find where you want to go and try to get there as fearlessly as you possibly can, and use the help of the mentors you trust.
So you talk about fearlessly, and Carl Hansen when we talked with him a couple of months ago, gave students the same exact feedback, except he used the word courage. Have courage and do this work. I wonder, what made you start 46 years ago thinking about sexual aggression? I'm sure that was not a popular topic or theme to start researching.
So that's a rather long story that I kind of have to go back to when I was first an assistant professor at Brandeis University, which in my early years was not the happiest of times. One of the things that occurred in those first years was the department hired Jim Ruff, who actually came from the University of Minnesota, and I had known him there as a student. And Jim and I collaborated on research in which we did a follow-up study of individuals subsequently diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I was looking to that research to be my ticket into getting tenure. My department fired Jim after 3 years, and I got feedback that they judged that the kind of research we were doing was useless and really was not psychology, and that's not going to be the basis of tenure. So at that point, I had to start looking for other positions. Judy and I had been separated our first year because we didn't get positions at the same time. She was at Florida Atlantic University and I was at Brandeis. We had finally just gotten back together again in Boston, and we didn't want to do that again. That was one of the most depressing years of my life. So we agreed at that time that we were never going to separate, and we were always going to move to places that were equal as far as the level of those for both of us. So I was sure Judy was going to get tenure, and I was not going to get tenure. So I let it be known in the area that I was looking for a job in this geographical location. And Murray Cohen and Theo Harris Seghorn both heard about my desire. And they also, interestingly, had read the research that I had done with Jim Roth on schizophrenia. So they called me up and they said, hey, we have a position for the director of treatment at Bridgewater Treatment Center. And we would like to talk to you about taking that particular position. So I went to the interview and they talked about the records that they had. And I said, oh, well, I'd like to look at these records. And so they got permission from the government that I was going, they were confidential records. And I spent 2 days reading these records. I was absolutely amazed. There was all sorts of information in these records that I didn't have in my schizophrenia data. And the process is a 60-day evaluation in which they pulled in all the information from the state, even information about foster houses, foster plans, and early incarcerations, and we had the actual records in this file. So I didn't have retrospective data only. I also had data that was concurrent with the early, and I said, oh my God, what a find. This is wonderful. So I was going to take that job, but then things turned around in my tenure decision. The research that I was doing in cognitive deficit and schizophrenia got some really good reviews. My mentors and my colleagues at the Society for Research in Psychopathology ended up being the people who wrote my reviews. And so I squeaked through and got tenure. So I went to Murray and Theo and said, hey, look, I think these data are wonderful. And by the way, I'd spent a day also in the library looking at all the research. This is back in 1977. I could read in one day everything that was done empirically on sexual aggression. And I said, oh my God, there's so much you can provide in this. So I said to Murray and Theo, hey, I got to deal with you. Hire my student, Ruth Rosenberg, and she and I will work together to get a grant to analyze your data. And they said, okay, fine. And so we did that. We first got a small grant where we got coders. And then I wrote this big mammoth grant to the National Institute of Mental Health. And the first feedback on that grant was, this is idiotic. The reason being, what I was proposing in 1977 was to create an actuarial technique that could predict outcome for sexual aggression, because that was going to be superior to clinical judgment. And they said, what an idiot. Experts are going to be better than a formula every time. But they also saw in that grant that I talked about creating typologies. And they said, this sounds like a really good idea. If you were to write a grant proposal that only had this in it, you would have a chance of getting funding. So I took the feedback, I wrote the grant, we hit on the grant, and we were off and running, and I was now addicted to sexual aggression research. So it was kind of like a really fortuitous rather than a planned thing that I went into. And I kept my schizophrenia and my sexual aggression research going for a number of years after that, and eventually I sort of settled at the end of my life in sexual aggression. But that's how I started.
Super interesting. So I would love to hear more about knowing that that was your start, and maybe you sort of tripped into it, for lack of any better word, how you felt about that first time someone said, like, why in the name of Pete would we spend time researching this? These are people that we don't even care about. We don't want to worry about those who cause sexual harm. So how did you handle that in the beginning?
That's a really interesting question because it was not just a question that I got when I was, so for instance, for my two sons, I was the treasurer for the Boy Scouts, and we would be in conversations and someone would say, "What do you do?" And I would tell them and they would all of a sudden, "Oh my God, I didn't know anyone did that," sort of thing. That was easy to handle because I could kind of just brush it off and tell people less about what I do in sexual aggression if there's circumstance called for it. But early in my career, I really wanted to leave Brandeis and get into a clinical psychology program. Um, that was where I thought I would fit best in my life. And as I told you before, Judy and I had agreed we could only move parallel. So we had to get positions for both of us, and that became a difficult thing to do. So I tried a lot to do that in clinical psychology programs. And what was interesting was that my research in sexual aggression was perceived in my applications not to be a positive, but to be a negative. And what the only offers that I got were pretty much dependent upon the research I was doing in schizophrenia. And people would say to me, just, don't emphasize. It's okay for you to continue to do that, but just don't emphasize that. Just talk about your schizophrenia research. So I never gave a talk in all of these job applications that it all dealt with my sexual aggression research. I was always talking about cognitive deficits, affective deficit, and schizophrenia, blah, 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 blah. So that was a real stumbling block. Um, and I never managed to get into a clinical psychology program. Obviously, the the best chance that I had was in 1999. I was asked to be the clinical director of the program at New York University, and that one was one that I could do. Judy and I couldn't. We tried, couldn't get equal moving positions up until that time, and so they agreed to give me an apartment a half mile from the psychology department as part of my bargain with them. They also offered me twice my salary plus $20,000, which was pretty good. So I was pretty sure I was going to be going there. I spent a year actually going back and forth between Boston and New York, and the department had an external evaluation, and I actually wrote the vision for the clinical department. They wanted me to turn their department from a psychoanalytical program into a psychopathology, an experimental psychopathology program. And so I was all set to take this position. And there were two reasons which I think are interesting in my sexual aggression research that I decided not to do this. One of them was that one of the things that I saw in my interviewing with all of the people and the placements and so forth in that year was that it was going to be a really difficult thing to turn this program from psychoanalytical into psychopathology. Um, in fact, the department hired a consulting group, which was 3 people who were current clinical directors, to give me advice on how I was proceeding. And I sort of intuited I was going to become an administrator for a long time. And I asked them, and they said, "Oh yeah, yeah, you're going to have to be an administrator for at least 3 to 5 years, and you're not going to get any research done." I kind of said, "Oh my God, that's like selling my soul to the devil." Administrator, I do not like administrative work. 3 to 5 years, I don't know if I could do that. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was the way in which I was going to accomplish this transition was all based in the area of schizophrenia. The reason being there were not a lot of placements that I could put the graduate students into. But when I went to New York, there were multiple places that were seeking me to collaborate with them on schizophrenia research. And that could be the basis of the change in the program. I had all these connections. And I realized at that point that if I made the decision to go down to New York and take this, that I'd have to give up my sexual aggression research and go full tilt back into schizophrenia. And I struggled over that, couldn't sleep. And basically in the area of schizophrenia, I was one person among a multitude of very bright people who were looking at the same issue. And I even had a student who was kind of taking my view and moving it forward. And so I had someone that, in sexual aggression, I was one of the very few people in the world who was interested in the underlying processes and in unpacking the etiological factors empirically of sexual aggression. So I had a kind of uniqueness there where I could make the greatest contribution. So ultimately, I decided I turned them down, which they couldn't believe that I turned them down. Fortunately, Brandeis negotiated with me, and that's a very weird story as well. When I went in to tell them I wasn't going to be there the next year because I was likely to take them to New York University, the chairman then called up the provost and the president, and the provost said to him right away, "Oh, we don't have to worry. Judy's not going to get a job in New York. Ray will have to stay here." That was because they knew about my history of trying all of these positions and not getting them. And then Joe said, no, he's going to take the train down there on Sunday night and come back on Thursday. And the provost said, "Oh, shit." And I got a call from the provost and the president saying, "Don't do anything because we'll negotiate." And the other funny thing about that is they asked me what they were offering, and I told them, and they didn't believe me. So they called up New York University what they were offering me, and they told them. And eventually, in my negotiations with Brandeis, I went from the bottom 5% of full professors to the top 5% of full professors in one jump in 1 year because of those negotiations. But yeah, that was probably one of the most challenging decisions I had to make in my entire life.
You know, one thing that I'm picking up on that you're saying repeatedly is this notion that you were balancing family and career very early in your career, 1 year in. And what would you say to folks who are earlier in their career, even mid-career, that are in that struggle of that finding that balance, which may or may not really exist? But what would you say to folks?
Well, I don't know that I achieved the optimal level of balance. Okay. Basically, I tried to be the best father that I could be, and also to contribute. Judy and I always had this agreement right from the first time we started living together that everything's split 50-50. And each of us pulls our own load and does our own things. And that there was no difficulty really doing that until we had kids, which was then more of a problem. And Judy's and my solution to that period of our lives was very different. Essentially, what I did is I gave up on sleeping. So, I mean, my ideal time in life during that time was the kids would go to bed. I was always the reader to the kids at night. And I would then, once they were off and sleeping, except for my third son, who would oftentimes come down and lie in the office on his blanket with me because he didn't want to go to sleep. But from 10 o'clock on till 2 or 3 in the morning was my time. No one would bother me. It was a time I could get writing done and I could do things. And I thought I negotiated pretty well on a little bit of sleep. But the stories that my family tells all these years later was that I was kind of a bit of a zombie in my life because I was pushing sleep so much that even though I did all the things that I was supposed to do as a good father, sometimes I wasn't emotionally in the situation as much as I should have been. And so I don't know that I negotiated it the best it could be. I managed to keep my career going and get my things done. My kids turned out terrifically, but I had Judy, of course, who gave up everything for the kids. I mean, her solution was the opposite to mine, that I'm not going to get anything done now. And that of course changed the trajectories of our careers as well. I mean, my career moved in a much more positive and successful direction than hers. She was at a successful career, but the fact that she gave up so much, I think, did have an impact. So it's a tough one. I don't really have a lot of advice. I think one of the things you have to do is make sure you choose a mate who's going to tolerate who you are and live with you, which I fell into. I didn't. I had some intuitions that she was such a terrific person, and I had to grab her. But yeah, I don't know how you negotiate that. It's gotten even worse. I mean, it's because it's gotten more competitive. So people are giving up having children, which is one solution to it. I find that sad because I absolutely love my kids. And now, as an old person, having them and my grandkids is very, very satisfying. And so it's tough. It is really tough. And my heart goes out to all of you young people who are dealing with it.
So pivoting a little, you've talked about a lot of things, and you've talked about one of the harder choices in your career. What are you most proud of?
So there are the two things in my life that stand out that always come up. So for instance, you're saying to yourself, "Oh my God, I got to produce more, blah 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 blah." And as an old person, one of the anxiety reduces is, "Oh, really? I don't have to do anything else because I've accomplished these things, and that's good enough." And the two things that are always occur to me are, first, in the area of schizophrenia, there was a major problem of empirically validating specific deficits cognitively in schizophrenics that was not accounted for by a general deficit. And I focused my early theoretical efforts on trying to solve that particular problem. And I think I solved it. It was against the then prevalent notions in the field. The Chapmans had this notion that the only way you could do it was with this psychometric solution that I thought was psychometrically faulty. And I thought that their method would not lead us in a positive direction. So I wrote an article in the Nebraska Symposium on motivation in 1983, in which I defended my model and I tried to use my research as an example of it. And the field since then has actually followed my direction rather than the Chapman's direction. They sort of died out after that. And interestingly, when I left schizophrenia in 2000, the last article that I wrote, my swan song to the area, was a Journal of Abnormal Psychology article that I wrote with Steve Silverstein, which was on this very issue. And those two articles have been some of the Nebraska Symposium and that Journal of Abnormal article have been two of my most cited articles. So that's incredibly gratifying because I perceive that I sort of helped to move the field in what was a very positive direction. In the area of sexual aggression, I would say that what I'm most proud of is the fact that when I moved from schizophrenia to sexual aggression, I had all of these visionary voices as to how it was I was to work in schizophrenia. I had had years of experience there. I took all of that and applied it to sexual aggression. And I think that the early model that I developed for how it is we're going to progress in research in sexual aggression was my best contribution in schizophrenia. So I combined a deductive, theoretically oriented research strategy with an inductive one, and essentially had them be iterative and produce models that I then tried to disconfirm. And it was that strategy and that integration of various kinds of approaches that really has produced all of the findings that I have had in my career that I think are the most important findings in sexual aggression. And so I'm really proud of that. But that harks back to my visionary voices. My mentors kind of gave me the structure, and I'm always a person that struggles with everything that's given to me. I'm a doubting Thomas, but they convinced me. And I think that was something that was very important. And I'm very proud of that kind of contribution to sexual aggression.
Sorry. I, of course, have someone at my door and the dog's barking. The, the joys of working from home in 2024, everything goes good until someone's at the door.
Yep.
Sorry about that. So within the world of ATSA, you are one of the voices that was all about prevention and bringing the thought of prevention into ATSA, and championing that. Why were you there, and how does it feel to have accomplished that within ATSA?
Well, why I was there is a very interesting story. Um, so I did agree early on to be on the ATSA board, and so I was elected after my second try. I lost the first election, and I then came on in the second election, which was in 1999. I was on the board, and Bill Marshall and then Keith Kaufman were the two preceding presidents. And during their time, we started talking about the importance of prevention, which was kind of like a anathema or an unheard of term in the area of sexual aggression treatment. And in fact, some of my efforts early on in my presidency to change the name of the organization to include prevention were voted down by 80 to 85% of the membership. So I was very supportive because I mean my career was started in that area. Early in my career, because of Garmazy, not only was I introduced to the area, but I also became a member of the Society for Life History Research. And so I early on rubbed shoulders with people like Sarnoff Mednick and Elaine Walker and Nikki Erlenmeyer Kimling and you know the great people in the life history research and all dedicated to primary prevention. So I thought this was really, really important. And indeed, my research, even up to that time in schizophrenia, I mean, in sexual aggression, was really geared to understanding underlying processes with the vision of moving forward into etiological models. And so I was very strongly a supporter of prevention. So Bill Marshall and Keith Kaufman got me aside and said, look, Ray, if prevention is going to be continued after us, you're the person to do it. You have to become president. And I said, what? Become president? You know, that's administrative stuff. I'm not your big man. I mean, you got to realize that this was exactly at the time. So 1999 through to my presidency started in 2004 was the time in which I'd made the decision, I don't want administration. In fact, I had Brandeis right into my contract that they couldn't ask me to do any administrative work like chairman or any other things at all. They couldn't ask me. They didn't follow that, of course, but so administrative stuff, and I'm saying, oh, you know, that's a lot of time. And that was the same kind of conflict. But they pushed and pushed, and they said, if you really believe in prevention, you've got to be the person so you have to run for president. And so I did and became president, and I pushed for prevention. So early on, that was kind of like a drive in ATSA that I've had from my very first beginnings at ATSA, and something that I think should be championed. And if you say what I think I should do in the future, I think that's the kind of thing that I should push for.
So we have a question, and the question is, what is your favorite prevention button?
Prevention button. Um, I think I think we've been successful in doing, and I think that because we changed the name. And so things have moved very, in a very positive direction from my perspective, over the history of ATSA. And part of the button that really has done that is to convince people that we're all in prevention. Treatment is a kind of prevention. Um, High risk or indicated research, which I really think is an important area to focus on, which is identifying those people who are at high risk and then providing treatment that helps Humpty Dumpty stay up on the wall and not fall down, and us have to try to pick up the pieces in therapy, which is one of the more difficult things in life to do. Keep Humpty Dumpty up on the wall, we're going to be able to keep him more intact. It's also Humpty Dumpty is not going to experience all of those negative consequences of having been convicted of a sexual offense. So they're going to remain more intact. So that I think that one of the buttons is to convince everyone. The primary prevention one, of course, is the ultimate one. We have to understand things sufficiently and do the prospective studies reasonably enough that we're able to institute sane prevention strategies for everyone, rather than just for the indicated or the high risk individuals. That's the hardest thing to do. I mean, all you have to look at something like global warming and trying to convince people when the science is so consistent, and obvious, that to convince them to spend money on primary prevention is going to be a real problem. It's also going to be a real problem because of the political climate that we have. So it's going to take years for that to come off. But the button of putting us all together and saying we're part of a continuum of prevention drives that all feed each other, and also to convince the people who are doing the therapy that they're the best people to kind of start giving society its feedback about, hey, I know a lot about sexual aggression, and these are the causative factors that we know now. Maybe we should do something about those, and maybe we should do something about them before the individual falls off the wall and all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I think that's kind of the button that you want to have people understand and support and get behind. And I think ATSA is moving in that direction.
So as you start thinking about the end of your career here, I don't know if your career is ever going to end, Ray, to be honest with you, but as you think about it, what do you hope people will continue forward, or what gaps do you hope people will research next?
Yeah, the first question about will I ever stop? It's kind of like I mean, as you age, one of the things that you experience is a decline in your cognitive abilities. I mean, I'm in a department that has a developmental aging program in it. And so I hear all the research on declines in cognition and the way in which we hear things and the way in which we process things. And I'm in those colloquia going, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. And that's very discouraging because you see things that you've lost, okay, and you can't do. So I think I'm only going to stop when that gets to be so bad that I can't do what it is I do. And I'm not quite there yet. I mean, I've lost a lot of things that I really treasured. For instance, I had an amazing episodic memory that I watched just deteriorate with age. So now I have to use all sorts of props and computers and everything else to prime me when I do things, rather than just having that stuff up there and I could access it anytime I wanted and pull it down and I could, put things in. Now I got to kind of set the stage and prime myself and get it. And then I can still do it. So it's okay. And that's fine. And I enjoy that. What it is I think should be done in the future, I've kind of already intimated that, which is I think we have to, as researchers, we have to really start at the underlying processes and understanding those in depth. And that's kind of what I'm doing in my current research. We're looking at and trying to unpack the the mediating variables that are in my etiological model to try and understand more and more what they're really about and what their kind of core mechanisms, both biologically and socially and developmentally, are. And doing that research is, as I indicated before, really critical for using measures, and multiple measures have to be used for making hypotheses about what it is we're going to look at if we start a prospective study. And the initial prospective studies, as we know from schizophrenia, are going to start with what we call the vulnerability or the high risk studies, where we're going to see, can we identify people, and can we change the trajectory of their lives once we've identified them? And that requires us to know the underlying process. So where I would like to go, and I would like to see the field go in a much bigger way, and not just a few researchers who are interested in this, is in that direction, which is a move also in theoretical move, which in the and I don't know if Carl talked about this, but I think that one of the things that the risk literature has to do is look at more theoretical models rather than just the empirically generated models to move risk assessment forward. So that's something that at least researchers agree on, but we have to do that. And we have to change the funding of the government and other organizations so that they will see the value of this and give money to it. NIH and NIJ, which are my favorite organizations giving me all sorts of money, don't want to hear those kind of research projects. You mention them and it's an immediate reject. And I find that very, very sad. I think we have to change that funding orientation. But I'm going to continue in my research to do just that and to pursue that kind of research. That's what feeds me, and that's where I think things have to go.
Awesome. We have a question from Marissa, and the question is, what are your thoughts about residential treatment for youth with problematic sexual behavior, and where do you see the direction of residential programs going in the future?
That's a really, really tough question, because initially, so I've done a lot of research in residential centers, both adult and juvenile. And we've also done research on comparing juveniles who have been treated in outpatient facilities as opposed to being treated in residential centers. And of course, the differences are confounded by the fact that the people who make the judgments to use residential treatment are trying to pick the youth that they see as the most problematic. So you find significant differences between the two. But our research has also suggested that there are consequences to residential treatment that are kind of like iatrogenic, potentially iatrogenic effects. So that in some of our data, we find that the juveniles who are in those centers are more highly sexualized than the adults that we've tested who were not in those centers, but as juveniles were identified as offenders. So it suggests that possibly those kind of centers can inadvertently, because of the use they put them with and the kind of this taking them out of their environments, really exacerbate some of the problems that we have. And I think that's a real concern. And youth with sexual behavior problems, that's going to be something that you're going to do. We know from the multi-systemic treatment that you can treat these youth in the community, and that you can get cooperation from families and from our social organizations, and and that's the most effective treatment we know with youth. So I would do everything we possibly can to make sure that youths are not put in juvenile facilities. Um, and that's kind of the best advice that I can give from the little bit of empirical data that we have on that. But I think it's enough to kind of be very wary of putting juveniles. Of course, if you have someone who's, I mean, some of the juveniles I interviewed during my career were so problematic. I mean, I can think of the most sadistic of those who were a danger to themselves and to society, that you might think, okay, well, for this youth, that kind of residential treatment program might be the best thing we can do for them and for society. But I think they're the really most extreme, least frequent kind of cases that we should have, and treatment should be outpatient in the community with the community and parental support.
Awesome. Well, we will see if there's any more questions that come in from the audience, but my final question is, if you could wave a magic wand and make it so there was less sexual harm, what would you do? What was the one thing you would do with that magic wand?
Well, actually, I'd wave it several times, because I think you can't just wave it once and have things happen. But I've already covered that ground, in the sense that the first one that I would wave would be to change the funding structure so that research into the early developmental antecedents and the understanding of the processes that are operating in sexual aggression would have a rich funding source, so that we could attract more students to that. We could train those students, and then they could get assistant professor positions or positions in research facilities that they could write grants, and we could start to get more and more. We have to do this, not just in the United States, but across the world. That we have to get the data that are going to give us the fundamental principles that are going to allow us to enrich our etiological models. So once we get that funding, then we're going to need, after that occurs, we're going to need a wand that's going to say, oh, well, now that we know some of these fundamental things, we have to fund etiological research. And the initial etiological research will first be more retrospective data, which is always problematic. Retrospective data are, at best, a good global understanding of what's going on, but not the specifics that you really need. That will generate the data that will fund, if we follow the schizophrenia route, that'll fund the more high risk kind of involvements in our understanding of that. Then once we have those data, then that will allow us to do the long prospective study. So I have to wave my wand again, and that's going to be in the future. And that's a problematic one, because we're now into the realm of people trying to prevent something rather than to deal with the pieces that are in front of them and putting them together. And that's a hard thing to do. As I said, you can't even get people to do it when their whole climate is imploding and they're still in denial. How how can you get them to do something like this and give money to it? But I'd wave my wand, and those studies would be done. And then once those studies are done, there's another waving of the wand. We know in the area of aggression, and in the area of criminology, a lot about what are the primary prevention factors that we can look at. Biological ones, supporting mothers who don't have enough funds to adequately take care of their pregnancies. Tremblay has shown you put the money into that, and all of a sudden you reduce all sorts of impulsive behavior later on. And he's also shown that you implement these particular programs and you save an incredible amount of money, not to mention the number of victims that you save, because you've stopped the behavior before. Do people listen to that? Are we implementing those kind of things? And the answer to that is no, people aren't implementing those. So the one then has to be waved third time, or maybe a fourth time, and we're going to have to make society invest the funds to do this primary prevention work. Um, Primary prevention is going to help us in impulsivity, in criminality, in bullying, in sexual harassment, in sexual aggression, sexual coercion. So this is something we have to do, but it's a long, long trek. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort by very bright people to negotiate all of this research. But I think it's ultimately the only way that we're going to go, that we can effectively, efficiently, and at the lowest cost actually put a stop to a lot of the problems that we have.
That's an awesome answer, Ray. There's one comment in the, I want to just make sure that you know, but there's an appreciation from a former student and current colleague. Ray guided my career and was extremely supportive for many years. Simply put, I wouldn't be doing what I am without him. And I'm pretty sure I'll retire before he does. And that is from Len Bard.
Oh, Lenny, love you, Lenny. Nice to see you. My offer on redoing the 1987 paper with a larger sample is still there. I'm trying to get to that. Yeah, I probably will retire. Lenny was one of my earliest students. I think that was back in 1975, 76. He was a great honor student, and I loved working with him. I I can't I can't imagine anyone who's been blessed as much as I have with absolutely phenomenal students. I mean, my students have gone on to do great things, both in the area of schizophrenia, the areas of manic depression, the areas of depressive research, depression research, um, and in all sorts of areas in sexual aggression. And of course, Lenny has been one of the successes in that. He's done a lot of work practically in the area of especially the legal aspects of an assessment of issues around sexual aggression. So I have to admit that I have truly, and even now, my students, my doctoral and master's students, kind of feed my life, and it's kind of like I have a family of sons and daughters. Um, uh, my current students are always worried about what's going to happen to me, and I have to take care of myself and sleep enough and make sure they stay around for the long haul because they don't want to lose me, and I don't want to lose them because it's kind of like another family. And so it's a great career, and students are one of the major benefits of that career, and everyone should embrace that.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for all you do. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for sharing all that you have shared. It's been a great conversation, and we appreciate you.
I appreciate ATSA, and I'm very supportive of the directions we're going in prevention.
So as we thank Ray, I also just want to remind folks that we have a webinar on Thursday. You can still sign up on our website at etsa.com on navigating problematic child sexual behavior. And we'll be digging into the updated ATSA guidelines on this. And conference registration is also open. We are in San Antonio this year. Ray will be there presenting with David Thornton for sure, and maybe some of his students, I would bet, would be there as well. And we look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks again to First Business Bank for sponsoring this conversation today. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you all for attending.